Dr. Sarah Crow. Feather stopped mid-stride through the hospital corridor, her clipboard clattering to the linoleum floor. In room 247, a 400-pound grizzly bear sat motionless beside her estranged mother's hospital bed, massive paw gently resting on Eleanor Whitehorse's frail hand. This wasn't protocol. This was impossible. Nurses pressed against the doorway, phones trembling in their hands as they live-streamed the unthinkable scene. Security guards stood frozen, tranquilizer guns useless against something this pure. The bear's dark eyes never left the 73-year-old woman's face, as if willing her back to consciousness through sheer devotion. Sarah's throat constricted. 20 years of veterinary training couldn't explain this. 5 years of silence between mother and daughter suddenly felt meaningless compared to the loyalty radiating from this wild creature who had somehow chosen Eleanor as family. "Ma'am, we need to evacuate the floor," a security officer whispered urgently, his voice cracking with disbelief. "But how do you separate a son from his dying mother? Even when that son weighs 400 pounds and was born in the wild?" Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 days earlier, Eleanor Whitehorse had awakened to the sound of meadowlarks outside her modest trailer on the edge of the Pine Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. At 73, her weathered hands still moved with the precision of someone who had spent decades caring for wounded creatures, though arthritis now made each morning a negotiation with pain. The Lakota woman had found her calling late in life, trading her classroom for cages filled with injured hawks and orphaned foxes after retiring from teaching on the reservation. Her daughter Sarah had inherited the same gentle touch with animals, but their relationship had been frozen in amber since Eleanor's husband died 5 years ago. The argument over his treatment, traditional medicine versus modern oncology, had carved a chasm between them that neither woman seemed able to bridge. Sarah blamed her mother for letting her father waste away with sage and prayers. Eleanor blamed her daughter for abandoning their ways when they needed them most. Now, Sarah worked as the lead veterinarian at Yellowstone's research station just 40 miles away, but it might as well have been another planet. Their last conversation had ended with Sarah's voice cracking. "You chose superstition over science, Mom. You chose death over fighting." Eleanor's reply haunted both of them. "I chose respect over control, daughter. Something you'll never understand." The rehabilitation center had become Eleanor's refuge, a place where her native wisdom about animal behavior merged seamlessly with basic veterinary care. She had a reputation for reaching the unreachable cases, the traumatized, the abandoned, the ones other facilities labeled too aggressive for release. Local rangers often joked that Eleanor could talk a rabid coyote into taking its medicine. Marcus Running Bear, head ranger and a distant cousin from the Crow Nation, stopped by most mornings with coffee and updates from the park. His 8-year-old son, Tommy, who struggled with autism, found peace among Eleanor's rescued animals. The boy's connection to wounded creatures reminded Eleanor daily why her work mattered, especially when her own family felt so fractured. Vincent Blackhawk remained a ghost from Eleanor's past, the troubled boy she and her husband had fostered 20 years ago after his parents died in a car accident. Vincent had disappeared one night during his senior year, leaving only a note. "Animals are safer in cages, so are people." Eleanor had searched for him, filed reports, prayed to every spirit she knew. Sarah never knew about her adopted brother. The timing had been wrong, the pain too fresh from other losses. Now, as Eleanor prepared breakfast for her current residents, a one-winged owl, twin raccoon kits, and a coyote with a healing leg fracture, she felt the familiar ache of incompleteness. Her daughter's absence, Vincent's mysterious fate, and her husband's death had left her feeling like a broken vessel trying to pour out healing she wasn't sure she possessed anymore. The radio on her kitchen table crackled to life with Marcus's urgent voice shattering her morning routine. "Eleanor, we've got an emergency rescue coming in. Something I've never seen before." The emergency call had come in at 6:47 a.m. from a hiker near Yellowstone's southeastern boundary. "There's something attacking a bear," the panicked voice reported. "I think it's a snake, but it's massive. The bear's in trouble." Marcus Running Bear had been skeptical until he crested the ridge overlooking Cascade Creek. Through his binoculars, he witnessed something that defied everything he knew about North American wildlife. A Burmese python, easily 15 feet long and thick as a telephone pole, had coiled itself around a male grizzly bear. The snake's muscular body wrapped around the bear's midsection like a living tourniquet, slowly crushing the life from one of nature's apex predators. The grizzly, a magnificent specimen weighing close to 400 pounds, thrashed weakly against his captor. His massive claws scraped futilely at the python's scales, while desperate huffs escaped his muzzle. The snake's alien yellow eyes remained fixed and unblinking, a cold intelligence that belonged in the swamps of Southeast Asia, not the American wilderness. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered into his radio. "Dispatch, I need immediate backup and a wildlife emergency team. We've got a situation unlike anything in the manual." By the time reinforcements arrived 20 minutes later, the bear's movements had grown sluggish. The python's constriction was methodical, patient, deadly. Each time the grizzly exhaled, the snake tightened its grip another inch, making the next breath harder to draw. "How the hell did a Burmese python get to Yellowstone?" demanded Jenny Clearwater, the senior wildlife biologist who'd raced to the scene. "These things don't survive our winters. Someone had to transport it here." Marcus was already formulating a rescue plan. "Doesn't matter how it got here. That bear's going to die if we don't act fast." He grabbed a long-handled hook from the emergency kit. "Jenny, you take the tranquilizer gun. If this goes sideways, put the bear down before he mauls someone. I'm going for the snake." The approach required surgical precision. Startle the python, and it might crush the bear's ribs in a final spasm. Move too slowly, and they'd be attempting to rescue a corpse. Marcus had dealt with aggressive wildlife for 15 years, but never anything like this primordial deathmatch between species separated by continents and evolution. The python sensed the humans approaching. Its massive head swiveled toward them, tongue flicking to taste their scent. The bear's eyes, clouded with exhaustion and oxygen deprivation, found Marcus's face. In that moment, the ranger saw something that would haunt him for days. Not the expected wildness of a trapped animal, but a desperate intelligence, almost human in its plea for help. "Easy, big guy," Marcus murmured, extending the hook toward the snake's head. "We're going to get you out of this." The python struck with lightning speed, missing Marcus's arm by inches, but the movement caused it to momentarily loosen its grip, and the bear managed to draw a deeper breath. That split second was all Marcus needed. He drove the hook behind the snake's head, while Jenny fired a dart into the python's thick body. The effect was immediate but terrifying. The python's thrashing sent both animals rolling down the rocky slope toward the creek. The bear, freed from the crushing coils, lay gasping on his side, while the drugged snake writhed in diminishing circles before finally going limp. "Is he alive?" Jenny called, scrambling down the slope with her medical kit. Marcus knelt beside the grizzly, noting the deep purple bruises beneath his thick fur where the python had compressed his rib cage. The bear's breathing was labored but steady. More surprisingly, he made no attempt to flee or attack, despite having two humans within striking distance. "He's hurt bad, but he's stable," Marcus reported. "We need to get him to Eleanor's place. She's the only one who might be able to help him." He paused, studying the bear's remarkably calm demeanor. "Jenny, look at his behavior. This isn't normal for a wild grizzly." The bear's eyes tracked their movements with unusual focus. When Marcus approached with the stretcher, the animal didn't growl or swipe defensively. Instead, he seemed to understand that these humans represented safety, not threat. "There's something else," Jenny said grimly, examining the unconscious python. "This snake has been recently fed. Look at the bulge in its midsection. Someone's been caring for it, keeping it alive." She checked the snake's mouth and found no wild prey remains. "Marcus, this python was released here deliberately. Someone wanted it to kill that bear." As they loaded the injured grizzly onto the transport stretcher, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they'd stumbled into something larger and more sinister than a freak wildlife encounter. The bear's trusting behavior, the python's suspicious presence, and the calculated nature of the attack suggested human involvement. The bear never took his eyes off Marcus during the 40-minute drive to Eleanor's rehabilitation center, as if he'd already chosen his rescuers as family. Eleanor's hands trembled as she examined the unconscious grizzly on her examination table. 40 years of working with animals had taught her to read their bodies like sacred texts, and this bear's story was written in scars that made her stomach clench. Beneath the fresh bruising from the python attack, she found older wounds, perfectly parallel lines across his shoulders that could only come from repeated cattle prod burns, and a distinctive circular scar on his left flank that bore the unmistakable mark of a circus brand. "My God," she whispered, her fingers tracing the old injuries with the reverence of someone who understood suffering. "What did they do to you, my friend?" Marcus watched from the doorway as Eleanor worked with the unconscious bear. "You recognize something, don't you?" Eleanor's weathered face hardened with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "These marks, I've seen them before. This bear was stolen from the wild as a cub and forced into entertainment." "The scarring pattern, the brand, it's from the Carvalho circus. They were shut down 8 years ago for animal cruelty, but the damage was already done." She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Marcus, I think this might be Little Thunder." The name hung in the air like a prayer and a curse. Eleanor had been part of the task force that raided the Carvalho operation, trying to rescue and rehabilitate the abused animals. Most had been too damaged to save, but there had been a young male grizzly, barely 3 years old, who had vanished during the chaos of the raid. The circus claimed he'd been humanely euthanized, but Eleanor had always suspected something darker. "If this is Little Thunder, then he's been surviving in the wild for 5 years since the circus closure," Marcus said, awe creeping into his voice. "That's almost impossible for a circus-trained bear." As if responding to his name, the bear's eyes fluttered open. Eleanor froze, expecting the wild panic that usually accompanied a large predator waking in captivity. Instead, the grizzly's dark eyes found hers and held steady. There was recognition there, not of her specifically, but of kindness. Someone who would choose healing over harm. The bear, she was certain now it was Little Thunder, grown into his massive adult frame, made a sound she'd never heard from a wild grizzly. It was almost conversational, a low rumble that seemed to ask rather than demand. His massive head turned slightly, taking in the familiar sights and smells of a rehabilitation facility, and his body language shifted from alertness to something approaching relief. "Eleanor, what's he doing?" Marcus asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio. The bear was looking directly at Eleanor with an expression that transcended species barriers. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his massive head and placed it on his paws, never breaking eye contact. It was submission, but more than that, it was trust. It was a choice. Eleanor's throat constricted with emotion she hadn't felt since losing her husband. He's asking permission to stay, she whispered. Marcus, in 30 years of wildlife rehabilitation, I've never seen anything like this. He understands that he's safe here. The implications hit Marcus immediately. Wild bears, even former captives, didn't voluntarily remain in human care. They fought, they fled, they followed every instinct that screamed freedom. But Little Thunder, now grown into the magnificent bear they'd started calling Kodiak, was choosing captivity over the wilderness that had nearly killed him. Eleanor, we can't keep a 400-pound grizzly as a pet. The regulations alone. He's not a pet, Eleanor interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades reading the souls of wounded creatures. He's asking for something else. Sanctuary. Family. A place where the nightmares stop. She moved closer to the bear, her arthritic hands steady as she gently touched his massive shoulder. Kodiak didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned slightly into her touch, a gesture so trusting it brought tears to Marcus's eyes. The sound of tires on gravel announced an unwelcome arrival. Through the window, Marcus spotted a familiar white pickup truck with government plates. His heart sank as Dr. Sarah Crow Feather emerged from the driver's seat, her expression already set in the professional mask she wore when dealing with her mother's unscientific approach to animal care. Someone called in a dangerous wildlife situation, Sarah announced as she entered the facility, her medical bag in hand and her jaw set for confrontation. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw the massive Grizzly lying peacefully on the examination table, her mother's hand still resting on his fur. "Mom, step away from that bear immediately," Sarah commanded, her voice sharp with panic and professional authority. "That animal could kill you in seconds." Eleanor didn't move. "Sarah, meet Kodiak, also known as Little Thunder from the circus raids 5 years ago. He's been surviving on his own since then, and today he chose to come home." Sarah's scientific mind rejected the implications immediately. "Bears don't choose anything based on emotion, Mom. They respond to food, territory, and mating instincts. That's it. Whatever you think you're seeing here is anthropomorphism, and it's dangerous." The tension in the room was palpable. Mother and daughter faced each other across the examination table with 5 years of unresolved grief and philosophical differences crackling between them like electricity. Kodiak's eyes moved from one woman to the other, his massive head lifting slightly, as if sensing the family dysfunction that surrounded him. "Look at him, Sarah," Eleanor said quietly. "Really look. When have you ever seen a wild bear behave like this? He's not drugged, he's not restrained, he could leave any time he wants. But he's choosing to stay." Sarah's veterinary training warred with the evidence before her eyes. The bear's calm demeanor, the deliberate way he'd positioned himself, the almost human intelligence in his gaze. It challenged everything she'd been taught about wildlife behavior. "This is exactly the kind of mystical thinking that killed Dad," Sarah said, her voice cracking with old pain. "Animals aren't people, Mom. They don't make emotional decisions." Kodiak rose slowly to his feet, his massive frame filling the small examination room. Both women held their breath, but instead of aggression, the bear moved with careful deliberation toward Sarah. He stopped just outside her personal space and sat down, his head tilted slightly in what could only be described as curiosity about the source of Eleanor's distress. The standoff between mother and daughter might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of Marcus's son, Tommy. The 8-year-old boy burst through the rehabilitation center's doors with the boundless energy that only interrupted his system during moments of extreme excitement or distress. Today, it was excitement. "Dad! Dad! Mrs. Eleanor, I saw the big truck and I know you got someone new and—" Tommy's rapid-fire chatter ceased abruptly when he spotted Kodiak. Instead of fear, wonder spread across the boy's face like sunrise. "Oh, wow. He's beautiful." "Tommy, stay back," Sarah commanded, but the boy was already moving toward the bear with the fearless curiosity that both blessed and cursed children on the autism spectrum. His neurological differences made him hypersensitive to emotional undercurrents, but paradoxically unafraid of physical danger. Kodiak's massive head turned toward Tommy, and something extraordinary happened. The bear's entire demeanor shifted, becoming impossibly gentler. He lowered himself to the floor, making his imposing frame less threatening, and made a soft, chuffing sound that Eleanor recognized as the greeting call mother bears used with their cubs. "He knows," Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with awe. "He can sense Tommy's differences. Animals often have an intuitive understanding of neurological diversity." Tommy approached without hesitation, his small hand extended palm up as Eleanor had taught him years ago when meeting new animals. Kodiak stretched his massive neck forward and gently sniffed the boy's fingers before giving them the lightest possible touch with his nose. Tommy giggled, a sound that Marcus hadn't heard from his son in weeks. "Can I pet him, Mrs. Eleanor? He smells like pine trees and sadness, but the sadness is getting smaller." Sarah's scientific worldview cracked a little wider. Tommy's synesthesia, part of his autism presentation, allowed him to perceive emotions as scents and colors. If he could smell Kodiak's emotional state improving, it suggested something beyond mere animal instinct was occurring. Over the following days, what happened at Eleanor's rehabilitation center defied every textbook Sarah had ever studied. Kodiak established a routine that spoke to intelligence rather than mere conditioning. Each morning, he would check on the other recovering animals, gently nosing the owl's cage, sitting quietly near the injured coyote's enclosure as if offering companionship to fellow survivors. But it was his relationship with Eleanor that truly confounded the scientific mind. The elderly Lakota woman had developed a routine of sitting with Kodiak each evening, speaking to him in a mixture of English and Lakota as she brushed his fur and checked his healing injuries. The bear would listen with focused attention, occasionally responding with soft vocalizations that sounded remarkably like conversation. "You've been alone for so long, haven't you?" Eleanor would murmur, her weathered hands working through his thick coat. "Running from the memories, trying to forget what they did to you in that circus. But you can't outrun pain, can you, my friend? Trust me, I've tried." Sarah found herself returning daily, ostensibly to monitor the bear's medical progress, but really to observe the inexplicable bond developing between her mother and Kodiak. Her veterinary training provided no framework for what she was witnessing. The bear displayed behaviors that suggested complex emotional processing, grief, gratitude, even what appeared to be protective instincts toward Eleanor. The breakthrough came on the third evening when Eleanor suffered a minor dizzy spell while preparing Kodiak's dinner. She steadied herself against the fence, but Kodiak noticed immediately. The bear moved to the fence line and extended his massive paw through the gaps, gently touching Eleanor's arm in what could only be described as concern. "I'm okay, big guy," Eleanor said softly, but her voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. "Just getting old. These bones have seen 73 winters, and sometimes they remind me." Kodiak made a low, worried sound and positioned himself as close to Eleanor as the fencing allowed. When she sat down heavily on a nearby bench, the bear lay down parallel to her, separated only by the chain link but clearly offering what comfort he could provide. That night, Sarah sat in her truck outside the rehabilitation center, wrestling with cognitive dissonance that threatened to overwhelm her scientific training. Everything she observed suggested that Kodiak was demonstrating emotional complexity, typically attributed only to humans and perhaps a few other highly intelligent species. But bears? The literature simply didn't support it. Her phone buzzed with a text from her research partner at Yellowstone. "Traced the python. came from an illegal exotic animal transport that crashed 3 days ago on Highway 14. Driver fled the scene. Most animals recaptured, but python and several others missing. Investigating possible wildlife trafficking ring. The news added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. If Kodiak had encountered the python as a result of illegal wildlife trafficking, it raised questions about whether his rescue had been coincidental or if he'd been specifically targeted. Sarah forwarded the information to Marcus and tried to push away the paranoid thought that someone might want Kodiak back badly enough to orchestrate his capture. Meanwhile, Eleanor's relationship with Kodiak deepened daily. The bear had begun displaying behaviors that suggested he understood human schedules and responsibilities. When Eleanor needed to care for other animals, Kodiak would settle patiently in his area, never demanding attention but always watching. When she returned, his entire body language would brighten with what could only be called joy. "He's imprinted on you," Sarah told her mother during one of their stilted conversations. "It's not healthy for either of you. Wild animals need to maintain their natural behaviors, not become surrogate children for lonely people." Eleanor's response was quietly devastating. "And what about lonely animals who need surrogate mothers? Does your science account for that?" The question haunted Sarah because she was beginning to suspect that her mother might be right. Kodiak's behavioral patterns suggested profound trauma followed by an equally profound healing process. He was choosing domestication not out of inability to survive in the wild. His 5 years of successful independence proved otherwise, but out of a need for emotional security that the wilderness couldn't provide. Tommy's observations added another dimension to the mystery. The boy spent hours each day sitting near Kodiak's enclosure, his autism-enhanced perceptual abilities picking up nuances that escaped the adults. "Mrs. Eleanor, Kodiak dreams about being small," Tommy reported one afternoon, his matter-of-fact tone belying the profound nature of his statement. "He whimpers sometimes when he sleeps, and his paws move like he's trying to run away. But when he wakes up and sees you, the scared smell goes away." Eleanor's heart broke a little more each day as she recognized the signs of complex PTSD in Kodiak's behavior. The bear startled at sudden, loud noises, particularly anything metallic that might remind him of circus equipment. He showed hypervigilance around any unfamiliar humans, but complete trust with Eleanor and gradually expanding acceptance of Marcus, Tommy, and reluctantly, Sarah. The healing process wasn't linear. Some days Kodiak would retreat into himself, lying motionless for hours as if trying to disappear from existence. On those days, Eleanor would simply sit nearby, sometimes reading aloud from old Lakota stories, sometimes just maintaining a peaceful presence that said without words, "You are not alone." "You remind me of someone," Eleanor told Kodiak during one of these quiet sessions. "A boy I used to know who had the same look in his eyes, like the world had been too cruel too early, and trust felt impossible. His name was Vincent, and he was so angry at everything that might hurt him that he couldn't see anything that might heal him." Kodiak's ears perked at the mention of Vincent's name, a reaction so subtle that Eleanor almost missed it. But the bear's entire body had tensed momentarily before relaxing again, as if the name carried some significance. The emotional complexity of Kodiak's rehabilitation was further complicated by Eleanor's own health issues. The stress of the confrontation with Sarah, combined with the physical demands of caring for a 400-pound bear, had begun taking its toll. She tired more easily, experienced occasional chest pains she attributed to anxiety, and found herself leaning more heavily on Kodiak's enclosure fence during their evening conversations. Kodiak noticed everything. When Eleanor's breathing seemed labored, he would position himself closer to the fence. When her movements seemed stiff with arthritis pain, he would remain motionless to avoid causing her any additional stress. The bear's emotional intelligence appeared to extend to physical caregiving instincts that defied scientific explanation. "Mom, you need to see a doctor," Sarah said during their most civil conversation in years, her professional concern temporarily overriding their personal conflicts. "You're showing signs of cardiac stress, and this situation with the bear is only adding pressure." "This situation with the bear is the only thing keeping me alive," Eleanor replied with startling honesty. "For the first time in 5 years, I wake up feeling needed, important, like my life has purpose beyond just waiting to die." The admission hit Sarah like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the depth of her mother's loneliness and the extent to which their estrangement had cost them both. She began to understand that Kodiak wasn't just healing from his own trauma. He was providing healing for Eleanor's as well. As the first week of Kodiak's residency drew to a close, the bear had established himself as more than a patient or even a permanent resident. He had become the emotional center around which Eleanor's world orbited, and increasingly the bridge that might allow a fractured family to find their way back to each other. But neither woman knew that Vincent Blackhawk had been monitoring their facility, or that the illegal wildlife trafficking ring had identified Kodiak as a particularly valuable asset worth retrieving at any cost. The black SUV pulled into Eleanor's gravel driveway at precisely 9 a.m. on a Thursday morning, its tinted windows and government plates immediately setting everyone on edge. Sarah happened to be checking Kodiak's healing progress when the vehicle arrived, and she felt her stomach drop as a tall, well-dressed Native American man emerged from the driver's seat carrying an official-looking briefcase. Vincent Blackhawk had aged well in the 20 years since Eleanor last saw him. His angular features had hardened into the kind of masculine authority that commanded rooms, and his expensive suit spoke of success in whatever endeavors had consumed his adult life. But Eleanor recognized those dark eyes immediately, the same wounded intelligence that had looked up at her from a broken 15-year-old boy who'd lost everything. "Hello, Eleanor," Vincent said, his voice carefully neutral as he approached the rehabilitation center's main building. "You look well? I see you're still collecting strays." Eleanor's hands trembled as she gripped the fence separating her from Kodiak's enclosure. The bear sensed her distress immediately, rising to his full, imposing height and moving protectively closer to where she stood. "Vincent, my God, I thought you were dead. We searched for you everywhere after you disappeared." "I know you did," Vincent replied, his gaze moving from Eleanor to study Kodiak with professional interest. "I appreciate that you cared. But I had to leave. This place, this life, it wasn't safe for anyone." Sarah emerged from the medical building, her veterinary instincts immediately cataloging the tension radiating from both her mother and the stranger. "Mom, who is this?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Eleanor's secret, the foster son she'd never mentioned, the brother Sarah never knew existed, was about to detonate their already fragile relationship. "Sarah, this is Vincent Blackhawk," Eleanor said quietly. "He lived with us for 3 years before you came home from college. He was your brother." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. "My... what? Mom, what are you talking about? I never had a brother." Vincent's expression softened slightly as he studied Sarah's face. "You were away at veterinary school when I came to live here. Your parents fostered me after my family died in a car accident. I was 15, angry, and convinced that the world was designed to destroy everything I might love." His eyes returned to Kodiak. "I wasn't wrong about that last part." The bear's reaction to Vincent was unlike anything Eleanor had witnessed. Kodiak's massive frame began trembling, not with aggression but with what appeared to be recognition and terror. He backed away from the fence, pressing himself against the far wall of his enclosure while making low, distressed sounds that cut straight to Eleanor's heart. "He knows you," Eleanor whispered, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. "Vincent, what did you do?" Vincent opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of legal documents. "I did what I had to do to survive after leaving here. I worked for circuses, exotic animal dealers, anyone who would pay me to handle dangerous animals. I got very good at it." He paused, watching Kodiak's fearful reaction. "This bear's name is Little Thunder. He belongs to me." The words hit the small group like a grenade explosion. Sarah's scientific mind immediately began cataloging the legal implications, while Eleanor's heart shattered with the understanding of what Vincent's presence meant for Kodiak. "You were part of the Carvalho circus," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You helped them abuse these animals." "I helped them control dangerous animals," Vincent corrected, though his voice carried a defensive edge that suggested his own doubts about that distinction. "After what happened to my father, I understood that wild animals need to be managed, contained, made safe. I was good at it because I understood their psychology." "Your father wasn't killed by an animal, Vincent," Eleanor said gently. "He died in a car accident. You were traumatized, confused. My father was killed by a grizzly bear during a camping trip when I was 12, Vincent interrupted sharply. "The car accident was our cover story because the insurance wouldn't pay out for an animal attack. I watched that bear tear him apart while I hid in a tree, too scared to help him." His eyes fixed on Kodiak with a mixture of fear and hatred. "I've spent my entire adult life making sure animals like that never hurt anyone again." The psychological profile clicked into place for Sarah's trained mind. Vincent's entire worldview had been shaped by childhood trauma, creating a twisted logic that justified animal abuse as protection. But the legal documents in his hands were what terrified her most. "Those papers don't mean anything," Sarah said, stepping protectively between Vincent and her mother. "The Carvalho circus was shut down for animal cruelty. Any ownership claims would be void." Vincent smiled coldly. "The circus was sold to new management before the investigation concluded. I purchased Little Thunder through legitimate channels, and I have all the paperwork to prove it." He gestured toward Kodiak, who continued to cower against the far wall. "He's been illegally held here for over a week. I could have law enforcement here within an hour." Eleanor moved closer to Kodiak's enclosure, her presence causing the bear to edge slightly forward despite his obvious terror of Vincent. "Look at him, Vincent. Really look. Do you see an animal that needs to be controlled? Or do you see a soul that's been broken by too much control?" "I see a 400-pound predator that could kill everyone here in seconds," Vincent replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Watching Kodiak's gentle interaction with Eleanor was clearly challenging his fundamental beliefs about animal nature. "He's been free to leave since the day we brought him here," Eleanor continued. "The gate isn't locked. He could walk out any time he wants. But he chooses to stay because this is the first place he's felt safe since you people stole him from his mother." "Animals don't make choices based on feelings," Vincent said, echoing Sarah's earlier arguments. "They respond to conditioning, food sources, territorial instincts. Whatever you think you're seeing here is projection." Tommy Running Bear chose that moment to arrive for his daily visit with Kodiak, his young voice carrying across the tense scene. "Kodiak, I brought you the apple slices you like." The 8-year-old stopped short when he saw the gathered adults, his autism-enhanced sensitivity immediately detecting the emotional turbulence. "Why does everyone smell angry scared?" Tommy asked, his innocent question cutting through the adults' pretenses. "And why does Kodiak smell like when I have bad dreams about the loud kids at school?" Vincent stared at the boy, his professional composure cracking slightly. "Who is this child?" "Tommy Running Bear," Marcus said, appearing from the parking area where he'd been observing the confrontation. "My son. He has a special connection with animals. particularly traumatized ones. Marcus's hand rested casually near his service weapon, though his voice remained calm. "Tommy, why don't you tell Mr. Blackhawk what you've observed about Kodiak's emotional state?" Tommy approached the fence where Kodiak had begun to relax slightly in response to the boy's familiar presence. "Kodiak has PTSD like my dad from when he was in the Army," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "He has nightmares about being hurt by mean people, and loud noises make him panic. But Mrs. Eleanor makes him feel safe, so the scared smell gets smaller every day." "Children with autism often have enhanced empathetic abilities," Sarah added, her veterinary training recognizing the validity of Tommy's observations. His descriptions of Kodiak's emotional states have been remarkably accurate predictors of the bear's behavior patterns. Vincent's carefully constructed worldview began showing cracks. Everything he'd been taught about animal psychology emphasized dominance, control, and the impossibility of complex emotional bonds between species. But the evidence before him, Kodiak's obvious trauma responses, his selective trust, his choice to remain in captivity rather than return to the wild, suggested a level of psychological complexity that threatened Vincent's entire professional identity. "This doesn't change the legal reality," Vincent said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier authority. "I have legitimate ownership papers, and I'm operating a fully licensed animal sanctuary in Montana. Little Thunder will be better cared for in a proper facility designed for his needs." "What kind of care?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Will he have human contact? Will he be allowed to form bonds? Will someone sit with him when he has nightmares?" "He'll have everything he needs to live safely and comfortably," Vincent replied, but his inability to meet Eleanor's eyes betrayed his own doubts about the sterile environment he was describing. Kodiak had gradually moved closer to the fence during the conversation, drawn by Eleanor's familiar presence despite his obvious fear of Vincent. The bear's behavior spoke louder than any legal document. When given the choice between his legal owner and the woman who'd shown him unconditional acceptance, he chose Eleanor. "Give me 48 hours, Eleanor said suddenly, her voice carrying the kind of desperate strength that comes from having nothing left to lose. "Let me say goodbye properly. Let me help him understand what's happening so he won't think he's being abandoned again." Vincent considered the request, his expression unreadable. 48 hours. But I'll be staying in town to ensure there are no attempts to relocate him. And I want daily documentation that he's being properly contained. As Vincent returned to his SUV, Eleanor's chest began tightening with stress-induced pain that she tried to hide from the others. But Kodiak noticed immediately, pressing his massive body against the fence and making soft, worried sounds that conveyed more empathy than any of the humans had shown each other. "We can't let this happen," Sarah said once Vincent's vehicle disappeared down the driveway. "There has to be a way to fight this legally." Eleanor sank onto the bench beside Kodiak's enclosure, her face pale with exhaustion and heartbreak. "He has legitimate papers, Sarah, and more money for lawyers than we could ever afford." She reached through the fence to touch Kodiak's massive paw. "I'm so sorry, my friend. I failed you just like I failed Vincent all those years ago." That night, Eleanor sat vigil beside Kodiak's enclosure while the bear lay pressed against the fence as close to her as possible. Neither of them slept much, both understanding that their time together was measured in hours rather than years. The bond they'd formed, transcending species barriers and healing decades of mutual trauma, was about to be severed by legal documents and a man whose own wounds had never properly healed. But none of them knew that Vincent Blackhawk was sitting in his hotel room, staring at his own legal papers and questioning everything he'd believed about animals, control, and the price of safety. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came at 3:17 a.m. when Kodiak's distressed roaring shattered the peaceful silence of the rehabilitation center. Eleanor jolted awake in her trailer, her heart immediately racing not just from the sudden noise, but from a crushing pain that spread across her chest like wildfire. She'd been having episodes of chest tightness for days, but this was different. Sharper, more insistent, accompanied by a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the bear's cries. Through her bedroom window, she could see Kodiak pacing frantically in his enclosure, his massive frame silhouetted against the security lights. The bear was exhibiting classic signs of severe anxiety, repetitive movements, vocalizations that bordered on panic, behaviors she'd witnessed in other animals experiencing psychological breaks. But Eleanor's trained eye recognized something more specific in Kodiak's distress. He was reacting to her pain. "How can you possibly know?" she whispered to herself, struggling to catch her breath as another wave of cardiac distress rolled through her body. The idea that an animal could sense human medical emergencies seemed impossible, yet Kodiak's behavior suggested an awareness that transcended normal sensory perception. By dawn, Eleanor's condition had deteriorated significantly. The chest pain came in waves now, accompanied by nausea and a weakness that made simple tasks like feeding the other animals nearly impossible. But she forced herself through her morning routine, driven by the knowledge that these might be her last hours with Kodiak before Vincent returned to claim him. Sarah arrived at 7 a.m. to find her mother sitting heavily on the bench beside Kodiak's enclosure, her face gray with exhaustion and pain. The bear pressed himself against the fence as close to Eleanor as possible, making soft, worried sounds that carried across the morning air like prayers. "Mom, you look terrible," Sarah said, her veterinary training immediately cataloging the signs of cardiac distress. "You need to be in a hospital." "I need to be here," Eleanor replied stubbornly, though her voice carried a breathlessness that betrayed her declining condition. "Kodiak's going through hell knowing he's about to be taken away again. He needs to understand that someone loves him enough to stay until the end." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Her mother was choosing to stay with a bear while potentially dying, yet had refused life-extending treatments when Sarah's father needed them. The parallel felt like a knife twist in an old wound. "This is exactly what you did with Dad," Sarah exploded, 5 years of suppressed grief and anger finally breaking free. "You chose your mystical beliefs over medical reality. You chose letting him suffer naturally over fighting for his life. And now you're doing it again." Eleanor's response was barely above a whisper. "I chose to honor his wishes and stay with him through the transition, just like I'm choosing to honor Kodiak's need for stability during his crisis. Some things matter more than extending life, like ensuring that life has meaning until the end." The philosophical divide between mother and daughter had never felt wider, yet Kodiak's presence somehow made their argument feel petty and small. The bear understood loss in ways that transcended human intellectualization. He'd lost his mother, his freedom, his trust in the world, and now he was about to lose the one being who'd shown him unconditional acceptance. As if sensing the emotional turmoil around him, Kodiak began displaying behaviors that Eleanor had never witnessed before. He gathered objects from around his enclosure, a piece of his favorite rope toy, a smooth stone he'd been playing with, one of Tommy's drawings that had blown into his area, and arranged them near the fence where Eleanor sat. The ritual-like behavior suggested a level of cognitive complexity that challenged every assumption about bear intelligence. "He's making an offering," Eleanor said wonderingly, her pain momentarily forgotten in the face of Kodiak's extraordinary gesture. "He's trying to give me everything he values because he understands that we're saying goodbye." Sarah's scientific skepticism warred with the evidence before her eyes. The arrangement of objects was too deliberate to be coincidental, too emotionally resonant to be mere animal behavior. "Animals don't understand abstract concepts like sacrifice or gift-giving," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Tommy Running Bear arrived for his usual morning visit to find the adults in emotional crisis and Kodiak exhibiting behaviors that even his autism-enhanced perception found overwhelming. "Everyone smells like ending," the boy announced with his characteristic bluntness. "Like when my goldfish died, but bigger. And Kodiak is trying to fix the ending with presents." Eleanor's chest pain intensified throughout the morning, but she refused Sarah's increasingly urgent suggestions to seek medical attention. "If I go to the hospital now, Vincent will take Kodiak while I'm gone," she insisted. "He'll wake up tomorrow and I'll just be gone like everyone else who ever mattered to him. I won't do that to him." The standoff continued until Marcus arrived with devastating news. "Vincent's moving up his timeline," he reported grimly. "His transport truck is already en route from Montana. He plans to load Kodiak this afternoon instead of waiting until tomorrow." The news hit Eleanor like a physical blow, triggering another episode of cardiac distress that left her gasping and pale. This time, Kodiak's reaction was immediate and dramatic. He began throwing his massive weight against the fence separating them, not in aggression, but in desperate attempts to reach her. The bear's distress calls echoed across the facility, drawing every animal in Eleanor's care into a state of agitation. "He knows," Eleanor managed between labored breaths. "He can sense that I'm dying, and he thinks if he can just get to me, he can somehow help. That's what family does. They don't abandon each other when things get hard." Sarah finally understood that her mother's refusal to seek medical treatment wasn't about stubborn mysticism. It was about keeping a promise to a creature who'd been abandoned too many times already. The realization forced her to confront her own assumptions about the nature of love, sacrifice, and what constituted rational behavior in the face of profound emotional bonds. "Mom, what if there was a way to keep him safe while getting you the medical care you need?" Sarah asked desperately. "What if we could find a legal challenge to Vincent's ownership claims?" Eleanor's response was cut short by the arrival of Vincent's transport truck, a massive vehicle equipped with hydraulic loading systems and reinforced containment units. The sight of it triggered an immediate trauma response in Kodiak, who began exhibiting the repetitive, self-soothing behaviors Eleanor recognized from his early days of recovery. Vincent emerged from his SUV with a team of professional animal handlers, their equipment and methodology suggesting an operation designed for efficiency rather than compassion. "I'm sorry to rush this," he told Eleanor, though his voice carried genuine regret. "But my facility has specific scheduling requirements, and delays could compromise Little Thunder's integration into his new environment." Eleanor struggled to her feet, her face ashen but her voice steady with determination. "Give me 5 minutes alone with him. Please, let me explain what's happening so he understands this isn't abandonment." The request clearly made Vincent uncomfortable, but he nodded curtly. "5 minutes. But my handlers will be standing by." What happened next would be seared into the memory of everyone present. Eleanor approached Kodiak's enclosure gate, and for the first time since his arrival, she opened it completely. The bear was free to run, to attack, to do anything his wild instincts might dictate. Instead, he moved slowly and deliberately to Eleanor's side, lowering his massive head to rest gently against her chest. "I know you're scared," Eleanor whispered, her hands stroking his thick fur with infinite tenderness. "I know this feels like betrayal, like being thrown away again. But I need you to remember something. Love doesn't end just because bodies separate. The bond we've shared, the healing we've done together, that stays with you forever." Kodiak's response was to wrap his massive arms around Eleanor in what could only be described as a hug, a gesture so profoundly human in its emotional expression that it left the assembled humans speechless. The bear held her gently, carefully, as if he understood her fragility and was trying to offer comfort rather than seek it. The 5 minutes stretched into 10, then 15. as no one had the heart to interrupt the goodbye taking place before them. Even Vincent's professional handlers found themselves moved by the obvious depth of connection between the elderly woman and the massive predator who'd chosen love over fear. When Eleanor finally stepped back, her face was wet with tears, but peaceful with acceptance. "Go with them," she told Kodiak softly. "Be safe, be strong, and remember that someone loved you enough to let you go." The bear's final gesture, placing his massive paw gently on Eleanor's chest one last time, triggered the massive heart attack that would change everything. Eleanor collapsed without warning, her hand pressed against her chest as the massive heart attack struck with devastating force. One moment she was standing beside Kodiak, saying their final goodbye, and the next she was crumpling to the ground like a broken bird. The bear's reaction was immediate and heart-rending. He dropped to all fours beside her fallen form, making sounds of distress that carried across the rehabilitation center like a funeral dirge. "Call 911!" Sarah screamed, her veterinary training taking over as she rushed to her mother's side. But even as she began CPR compressions, she could see the gray pallor of Eleanor's skin, the weak and irregular pulse that suggested massive cardiac damage. "Mom, stay with me. Please, don't leave like this." Vincent stood frozen, watching the scene unfold with the kind of horrified fascination that comes from witnessing the exact moment when everything changes forever. His professional handlers waited uncertainly by the transport truck, their equipment ready but their purpose suddenly seeming obscenely inappropriate given the medical emergency unfolding before them. Kodiak refused to move away from Eleanor's unconscious form. When the paramedics arrived 15 minutes later, an eternity in cardiac emergency time, they found the massive grizzly bear lying protectively beside the elderly woman, his huge body creating a barrier between her and the world. He didn't growl or show aggression. Instead, he watched with intelligent eyes as the emergency medical team worked to stabilize Eleanor's failing heart. "We can't work with that bear right there," one of the paramedics said nervously, his hand moving toward the radio to call for animal control backup. "You won't need to," Sarah said quietly, moving slowly toward Kodiak. "He won't hurt anyone. He's trying to protect her." She knelt beside the bear and spoke in the same gentle tone she'd heard her mother use countless times. "Kodiak, they're here to help her. You need to let them work." The bear's response defied every textbook Sarah had ever studied. Kodiak looked directly into her eyes, a prolonged, meaningful gaze that seemed to communicate understanding, and then slowly moved back several feet. He remained close enough to watch everything the paramedics did, but far enough away to give them working room. It was cooperation born of intelligence and emotional comprehension, not conditioning or fear. The 40-minute ambulance ride to the regional hospital became a surreal convoy. Eleanor was loaded into the emergency vehicle, unconscious and barely clinging to life. Sarah rode with her mother while Marcus followed in his truck. But most remarkably, Kodiak had somehow been allowed to travel in Vincent's transport vehicle, pressed against the reinforced windows as if trying to maintain visual contact with the disappearing ambulance. "This is insane," Vincent muttered as he drove, glancing in his rearview mirror at the bear who had positioned himself to watch the road ahead. Animals don't understand medical emergencies. They don't form attachments that override their survival instincts. But even as he spoke, Vincent was questioning his own words. Kodiak's behavior throughout the crisis had displayed a level of emotional intelligence that challenged everything Vincent believed about animal psychology. The bear had shown restraint, cooperation, and what could only be described as grief, all in service of protecting someone he loved. At the hospital, Eleanor was rushed into emergency surgery while her unlikely family gathered in the cardiac unit waiting room. Sarah paced frantically, her hands shaking as she signed medical consent forms and tried to process the reality that her mother might die before they could reconcile. Marcus sat quietly with Tommy, the boy's autism-enhanced empathy making him hypersensitive to the emotional chaos surrounding them. Outside in the hospital parking lot, Vincent sat in his transport truck with Kodiak, both of them staring at the illuminated windows of the cardiac surgery unit. The bear hadn't eaten or drunk anything since Eleanor's collapse, his massive body trembling with stress as he maintained his vigil. Every few minutes he would make soft vocalizations, not roars or growls, but sounds that resembled grieving. "She might not make it," Vincent said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the bear or to himself. The heart attack was massive. Even if she survives the surgery, the damage could be irreversible. Kodiak's response was to press his face against the transport window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the hospital entrance with unwavering focus. The bear's dedication forced Vincent to confront uncomfortable truths about his own motivations. Was he really protecting people from dangerous animals, or was he projecting his own trauma onto creatures who were capable of love and loss just as profound as any humans? Inside the hospital, Sarah experienced her own moment of revelation as she sat beside her mother's hospital bed following the successful but touch-and-go surgery. Eleanor remained unconscious, her frail body connected to machines that monitored every heartbeat and breath. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic about her survival, but warned that full recovery would require months of intensive care. "I'm sorry, Mom," Sarah whispered, holding her mother's unresponsive hand. "You were right about so many things, and I was too stubborn to see it. You understood something about love and healing that I missed completely." She paused, watching the steady rise and fall of Eleanor's chest. "Kodiak isn't just an animal to you. He's family. And I took away 5 years of being your daughter because I couldn't accept that healing doesn't always look like what science textbooks describe." The breakthrough came at 2 a.m. when one of the night nurses mentioned the unusual situation in the parking lot. "There's a bear in a transport truck that's been sitting out there for 12 hours, she told Sarah. "Animal control wants to have it removed, but the owner claims it's somehow connected to your mother's case." Sarah rushed outside to find Vincent sitting beside the open transport door, Kodiak pressed against the exit as if trying to will himself through the metal barriers that separated him from Eleanor. The bear's distress was palpable. He hadn't moved from his position facing the hospital, his massive frame rigid with vigilant waiting. "He won't eat," Vincent said without preamble, his voice heavy with exhaustion and confusion. "He won't drink. He just sits there staring at that building like he's trying to see through the walls to where she is." Vincent's carefully constructed professional facade was crumbling. "This isn't normal animal behavior, Sarah. This is something else entirely." Sarah studied her foster brother's face, seeing for the first time the frightened boy who had disappeared 20 years ago. "What are you really afraid of, Vincent? That animals might have feelings, or that those feelings might be deeper and more loyal than most humans ever manage?" The question hit Vincent like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the psychological foundation of his entire adult life. If animals can love the way he obviously loves Eleanor, then what does that make me? What does that make everything I've done to them in the name of safety and control? The conversation was interrupted by Kodiak's sudden change in behavior. The bear's head lifted, his ears perking forward as if he'd heard something beyond human perception. A moment later, Sarah's phone buzzed with a call from the hospital. Eleanor was awake and asking for her boys. The reunion that followed challenged every regulation, protocol, and policy that separated the human and animal worlds. Hospital administrators initially refused to allow a grizzly bear anywhere near their facility, but Eleanor's cardiac specialist made an unprecedented decision based on her patient's psychological needs. Mrs. Whitehorse's recovery depends significantly on her emotional stability, Dr. Martinez explained to the assembled hospital staff. Her stress levels spike dangerously every time we discuss the bear's absence. From a purely medical standpoint, denying this reunion could trigger another cardiac event. Vincent found himself in the surreal position of helping to arrange the logistics of bringing a 400-pound grizzly bear into a hospital room. His expertise with animal handling, originally intended to facilitate Kodiak's removal, instead became crucial for making the reunion safe and possible. When Kodiak was finally wheeled into Eleanor's room on a specialized gurney, sedated just enough to ensure safety but alert enough to interact, the bear's immediate focus was entirely on Eleanor's face. He made soft, questioning sounds as if asking whether she was truly alive and safe. "I'm here, my friend," Eleanor whispered, her voice weak but filled with joy. "I'm not going anywhere without you." Kodiak's response was to gently place his massive paw on the hospital bed beside Eleanor's hand, not touching her directly but close enough to maintain physical connection. The gesture was so tender, so precisely calibrated to avoid causing her any discomfort, that it left everyone in the room speechless. Vincent watched this interaction with growing amazement and horror at his own past actions. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something about Little Thunder, about Kodiak. I was there when we took him from his mother. I helped design the training protocols that broke his spirit. Everything he suffered, everything that made him afraid to trust, I was part of that." Eleanor's response surprised everyone. "I know, Vincent. I've known since the day you arrived with those papers. But look at him now. Look at what he's chosen despite everything that was done to him. He could hate all humans forever, but instead he chose to love again." That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing any of us can do. The moment marked the beginning of three fundamental transformations: Eleanor's long journey back to physical health, Sarah's emotional journey back to her mother, and Vincent's spiritual journey toward understanding the difference between control and care. But it was Kodiak who had catalyzed all three healing processes, proving that sometimes the most profound teachers come in the most unexpected forms. 3 months after Eleanor's heart attack, the Pine Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had become something unprecedented in wildlife management, a place where the line between rehabilitation and family had been permanently blurred. Eleanor's recovery had been slow but steady, aided by daily visits from Kodiak, who had been granted a special therapeutic animal designation that allowed him to remain at the facility indefinitely. The legal battle over Kodiak's ownership had resolved itself in an unexpected way. Vincent Blackhawk had voluntarily surrendered his claims and donated substantial funding to transform Eleanor's modest facility into a specialized sanctuary for circus-traumatized animals. His redemption had been neither quick nor easy. Months of therapy had helped him process the childhood trauma that had driven his need to control and contain wild creatures. "Healing isn't about forgetting the past," Vincent told Eleanor during one of his weekly visits to the center. "It's about choosing a different future, despite what the past tried to teach us." He watched through the window as Kodiak gently interacted with Tommy Running Bear, the autistic boy having formed his own profound bond with the massive bear. "Kodiak taught me that survival sometimes means learning to trust again, even when every instinct screams that trust equals vulnerability." Sarah had taken a leave of absence from her position at Yellowstone to help her mother recover and to study the remarkable interspecies bonds developing at the sanctuary. Her scientific papers on trauma recovery and captive-born wildlife were gaining international attention, but more importantly, her relationship with Eleanor had healed into something deeper than it had ever been before. "I spent so many years thinking that emotion was the enemy of good science," Sarah reflected as she and Eleanor sat watching Kodiak's afternoon routine. But what I've learned here is that emotion might be the most important data we've been ignoring. Kodiak's capacity for love, grief, loyalty, and forgiveness aren't just touching stories. They're measurable psychological phenomena that challenge our fundamental assumptions about consciousness and sentience. Eleanor's pregnancy announcement had come as a shock to everyone, including herself. At 45, she had assumed that chapter of her life was closed, but the stress and upheaval of the past months had somehow reset her biological systems, and she found herself carrying the child she'd never thought she'd have. The news had strengthened her resolve to create a legacy that honored both scientific advancement and traditional wisdom about the interconnectedness of all living beings. This little one will grow up understanding that intelligence and emotion aren't limited to humans, Eleanor said, her hand resting on her small but growing belly as she sat beside Kodiak's enclosure. They'll learn that family is defined by choice and commitment, not just genetics. Kodiak had somehow sensed Sarah's pregnancy before she'd even taken a test, his behavior around her becoming noticeably more protective and gentle. The bear's intuitive understanding of human biology added another layer to the mystery of his emotional intelligence, suggesting that the bonds between species could operate on levels that science was only beginning to explore. The sanctuary had become a pilgrimage site for families dealing with trauma, particularly those involving children with special needs like Tommy. The boy's autism had made him hypersensitive to emotional undercurrents, but also uniquely capable of communicating with traumatized animals in ways that neurotypical humans couldn't match. Animals and autistic people both experience the world more intensely, Eleanor explained to a visiting researcher. Tommy doesn't see Kodiak as a dangerous predator. He sees him as a kindred spirit who understands what it feels like to be misunderstood by a world that values conformity over authenticity. Vincent's transformation had been the most dramatic of all. The man who had once viewed animals as dangerous creatures requiring constant control now spent his days designing enrichment programs that honored each animal's psychological needs. His intimate understanding of trauma, both human and animal, made him uniquely qualified to help other damaged souls find their way back to trust. I used to think strength meant never showing vulnerability, Vincent admitted during a group therapy session he'd started for other wildlife professionals dealing with compassion fatigue. But watching Kodiak choose love over fear every single day has taught me that real strength is the willingness to keep your heart open even after it's been broken. The center's success had attracted national media attention, with documentaries and news features highlighting the revolutionary approach to wildlife rehabilitation that prioritized emotional healing alongside physical recovery. But for the small family that had formed around Kodiak's recovery, the attention felt secondary to the daily miracle of watching broken beings choose to trust and love again. As autumn painted the Montana landscape in brilliant colors, Eleanor sat in her favorite spot beside Kodiak's enclosure, her expanding pregnancy making the wooden bench increasingly uncomfortable but her spirit more peaceful than it had been in years. Sarah worked nearby, documenting Kodiak's interactions with the sanctuary's newest residents, 2 circus elephants and a traumatized chimpanzee who had all begun showing remarkable progress under the bear's gentle influence. "He's become a healer himself," Eleanor observed, watching as Kodiak approached the nervous chimpanzee with the same patient gentleness he'd shown her during those first terrifying days of recovery. Pain recognized pain, and chose to offer comfort instead of adding to the suffering. Tommy's laughter echoed across the sanctuary as he and Kodiak engaged in their daily game of gentle wrestling, the massive bear carefully controlling his strength to match the 8-year-old's energy. Vincent watched from the administrative building, his phone buzzing with calls from facilities around the world seeking guidance on implementing similar trauma-informed approaches to wildlife care. The phone calls could wait. This moment, watching a former captive teach other survivors that healing was possible was more important than any professional obligation. It was proof that love, given freely and without conditions, could transform the world one broken heart at a time. At 73, Eleanor Whitehorse discovered something that challenges everything we believe about aging and purpose. When a 400-pound grizzly bear chose her as family, she learned that life's most profound chapters often begin when we think our story is ending. This isn't just about an extraordinary bond between woman and bear, it's about the truth that resonates in every grandparent's heart. We're never too old to matter, to be needed, to love, and be loved unconditionally. How many of us have felt invisible in a world that worships youth? How many have wondered if our best days are behind us? Eleanor's story proves that purpose doesn't have an expiration date. Sometimes the family we need most arrives in unexpected forms, through a rescued animal, a estranged child finally coming home, or a new grandchild who sees us as their whole world. The bear didn't see Eleanor's age, her arthritis, or her tired hands. He saw someone who offered safety, understanding, and unwavering commitment. That's the gift we seniors possess. The wisdom to love without conditions, the patience to heal what's broken, and the strength that comes from surviving life's storms. What unexpected relationship has taught you the most about love in your later years? Have you ever felt chosen by someone who needed exactly what you had to offer?